Nice.
I didn't have it.
Good evening, everyone. Hi. Welcome. I think I know everyone for psychology. I'm just saying, I'm Elizabeth Burdine, interim director of the American Academy in Rome, but I am. And it's my really great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Lindsay Harris, our interim Andrew High School Arts Director and tonight's speaker. And before moving into my introduction of Lindsay, I want to remind you all that this is the last of the 4 staff lectures with which we began our programming this year. And next Monday, we'll launch into the real business, the really fun business of fellows presentations, the Shock Talks, which will be held in this lecture room, but we'll be beginning at 6 p.m. rather than 6:30. So make a note of that. We felt like we needed more time with the 2 of you for Q&A and a little time to celebrate afterwards. So we moved it back half an hour. Our first speakers will be scholar January Feeney and writer Jessica Hagedorn, and you can find details of their lectures and future lectures on our website. So now I want to turn to Lindsay. Lindsay Harris has a long-standing relationship with the American Academy, and I was really thrilled when she joined our team this summer. As a scholar of photography, she has a tremendous range of interests, developing the art form itself, of course, but also its role as a maker and a documenter of modernity. We have already seen in conversations in a walk many of us took with her from Piazza Cavour to the Attests, how Lindsay's vision envelops all of Rome, ancient and modern, built and inscribed, narrated, imagined, and represented. Some of this comes, of course, from her long-standing relationship with the city. Lindsay was Andrew W. Mellon Professor in Charge of Humanities here at the Academy from 2014 to 2018, and held the Andrew and Marion High School postdoctoral fellowship in modern Italian studies in 2014. Prior to this, she was a research associate in the Department of Photographs at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., where she worked with the curatorial team to organize exhibitions of photographs from the mid-19th through the 21st centuries. One project of note in this context, at the AAR, that is, was Tell It With Pride, Augustine, St. Gaudens, and the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. And it's of note because St. Gaudens, and I may be saying his name wrong, Gaudens, was an early supporter and founder of the American Academy in Rome, and because his monument is important in current conversations about how we memorialize the Civil War. Lindsay Harris's first book, now under review, is titled An Eye for Photography and the Myths of Primitivism in Italy. Lindsay has also authored essays and articles for edited volumes, exhibition catalogs, and journals, including the Italian Quarterly and the Journal of Modern Italian Studies. Tonight's talk is based on an article forthcoming in the volume of For an Eye, Photography, Women, and Global Encounters, edited by Hee-Wan Yoon and Jordan Troller. Lindsay is also a curator and has organized several exhibitions here at the American Academy. I'm really sorry that I missed them. Okay. 3 women photographers and the very powerful Matera Imagine, Photography in a Southern Italian Town, which traveled to Matera in Basilicata and to the Italian Cultural Institute in New York City. She received a European Union grant in support of this work. And she brought us some of the photos to have a look at. If you didn't see them before, you can have a look after. And I have a particular fondness for them because I got them hanging in my apartment for a couple of years. It's really fun to live with those prints. There are a raft of other exhibitions I could mention, including Masters of Collage from Picasso to Rauschenberg for the Joan Miró Foundation in Barcelona in 2006, and online, The Lives of Everyone, photographs from the Stand Royal New Jersey collection at Temple University Rome with the New York University Alumni Association. Lindsay's MA and PhD are from the Institute of Fine Arts at NYU, and she holds a BA in Art History and English Literature from Bowdoin College. Lindsay is a skilled teacher, as we have all seen. In addition to teaching at Amherst College and Northeastern University in Rome, she has served as a lecturer in the history of photography at Luis University in Rome, and currently is managing editor of the Humanities Connect journal at the Max Planck Institute for Art History, also in Rome. She also serves on the Advisory Council for Curatorial Affairs at the Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art in Gallarate, outside of Milan. In addition to the Rome Prize, Lindsay Harris has received honors and awards from Amherst College, the Center for Creative Photography, and the N.W. Mellon Foundation. And Lindsay will speak to us tonight, and it's such a good title, on Fueling the Carbon Empire, Esther Bubley's Standard Oil Photographs Abroad.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for that kind introduction, and to everybody who has joined us this evening in this room. And for those of you who are following on from elsewhere, welcome. Happy to see you and know that you're there. I do want to begin with just a few other thanks to Mark Robbins for the opportunity to be here this evening and with you all this year. It's really a great honor that I'm really pleased about. And also to people who have supported this research specifically. Research from Rome during a pandemic at an archive in Kentucky is impossible without the generosity of people like Amy Hannaford Purcell, who is the chief archivist of the Standard Oil collection, whose generosity and willingness to collaborate with me from afar is just essential to anything that I'm about to say tonight. So thank you to her and to Jean Bubbly and Tracy Schmidt at the Esther Bubley estate, who's again great willingness to let me use these images and talk about them, show me images that I was unable to find elsewhere, has been instrumental. I also want to give a shout out to my predecessor, Peter Benson Miller, who was the arts director 2 times ago. He is a great friend, a great listener, and a great questioner. And I'd like to thank him for helping me get my ideas going about this material. It really is thanks to great colleagues and to the environment that the Academy sets up, that anyone really is able to make anything of their research, not the Academy, but their friends and colleagues. And I want to acknowledge him for that. And lastly, Cheryl Wasserman, who was a great support in that temple exhibition, which was an online very first foray into this material, which was exactly a year ago, October 2020. So in small annual steps, we will eventually make progress in this project. So what I wanted to do tonight is perhaps a different approach than that of my colleagues, whose work we have heard over the past 3 weeks, who all gave very polished, fine presentations of work that is published, almost completed, or if not complete, nonetheless in the works for years, maybe not decades, in the way that these projects tend to be. This is different from that. This is me taking an opportunity to share with you my really initial findings about material I'm very excited about, still discovering, and I'm eager to share with you to really open a conversation that I hope can last in fits and starts throughout the whole year as we spend time together and have time. Already I've learned so much, and what you've observed about your own work has already shaped my thinking about this material, and I hope to give some sense of that in my remarks today. So they really are, I'm not reading a paper, I'm just going to talk through the material that I have and my initial findings about it so far. Last but absolutely not least, I want to say hello to my family and thank them for their support if they're here and watching. Okay, so I wanted to begin a little bit with how this research fits into the broader project that I try to do as an art historian and curator. As Elizabeth mentioned, during my previous time here at the Academy in the guise of Mellon Professor of Humanities, my time here culminated in an exhibition on the southern Italian town of Matera in the Basilicata region, close to but still far from the Puglia locations that you'll visit on your fall trip. Matera remains far. People still think of it as kind of hard to get to, and on public transportation, even to fly there, you have to fly to Bari, and that's not even that close. And I put together this exhibition to see how photographers were nonetheless attracted to this town and have been attracted to this town from the 1950s. There's certainly a prehistory, but that wasn't what the show was about. I focused on this moment from after the Second World War, after the publication of Capovelli's book, Christ Stopped at Italy, put Matera on the map. Photographers from all over the world really flocked there. You were as likely to see a photographer from Italy as you were from New York City or Paris in Matera in 1952. Through the 21st century, how this town continued to attract people and the ways in which those photographs shaped not only our idea about Matera as either an epitome of southern Italian backwardness because of its ancient cave dwellings. That's what's so singular about Matera, is its landscape of cave dwellings. or the fact that by 2019, it was a European capital of culture for those very same ancient cave dwellings. And that's a very big mental shift in terms of perceptions of place. But I was mostly interested in the first part of the exhibition in how photographers also shaped public policy. They shaped the abandonment of the Sassi, that's the core nucleus of these cave dwellings. They shaped the development of new towns and the new neighborhoods in the regions to which those people were displaced. Photographers really played an instrumental role in shaping how people lived and the physical development of a town. And that way in which photographers can play an active role in transformation, in modernity, is something at the heart of my work. Two of the photographs in that show, the prints of which those of you in the room can see here. One on the left shows women in black who have just hung up laundry. We can imagine washed by hand. There's a shadow of it on the ground, creating this geometrical frame in a kind of whitewashed stone urban environment. And on the right-hand side, you see a panorama of the landscape around Matera that, if it were on a clear day, can extend almost to the Bay of Taranto. You see a paved road, newly paved, it seems, it's very smooth, winding across this somewhat hilly terrain, and in the center of the photograph, in the foreground, you see a donkey pulling a cart. So these two photographs, I thought, okay, these show Matera and its environment. But they were taken by an American woman, Esther Bubley, in 1952, and I thought, what was she doing there? She was not the only American woman to photograph Matera in the 1950s, as my exhibition demonstrated, and there were women who were there through the US government. There were other photographers who had been sent there through other Italian connections. But the fact that Esther Bubley was sent there by Standard Oil, New Jersey, opened up my eyes to the fact that many of the photographers most associated with American social documentary photography, and I'll talk about what I mean by that in a minute, actually also worked really at the same time to fuel American capitalism. And this juxtaposition in the history of photography is not one that many people discuss, although some people certainly in the history of photography know of this case, and there are certainly other ways in which American documentary photographers collaborate and contribute to major corporate projects, or their photographs, some of their most compelling work and innovative work is published in venues like Fortune magazine. All of this I'm starting to put together as part of a larger project, looking at the ways in which American social documentary photography and capitalism cooperate in the 1950s, 40s and 50s. It's a big chapter of American photography, it's a big chapter of American art, but nobody's really put it all together yet, and that's what I'm thinking about doing. So, Esther Bubley, I have here my art historian's little clicker. Here you see her in a portrait taken by Gordon Parks. These names might start to be familiar to some of you, but I'm going to talk to you more about them specifically for those of you for whom these names remain unfamiliar. Here's an image of Esther Bubley with her camera in hand, taken in 1944 in Baywater, New Jersey, at an oil refinery plant. Ordinarily, if you see a photograph, a portrait of Bubley, you might not think much about her surroundings in this context. But when you start to think about her relationship to Standard Oil by 1944, it all starts to make a little bit more sense. Now, if I say American social documentary photography, chances are that the images like the two portraits of women who I've put for you here might be among the images that come to mind. These are arguably two of the most well-known, copied, printed, reproduced photographs taken of any two Americans in the 20th century. You're seeing Gordon Parks's government charwoman. Also, they're so famous, these photographs, that they have taken on names of themselves. American Gothic, taken of Ella Watson in Washington, D.C. in 1942. She's a woman who spent her life cleaning the American government buildings in Washington, D.C. Gordon Parks did a photo story about her in 1942. And I'll say more about that in a minute. And then a counterpart taken somewhat earlier by Dorothea Lange. The title given by the project for which the photograph was taken, Destitute Pea Picker in California, Mother of 7 Children, age 32, Nipomo, California, or as we've come to know her more famously, My Good Mother. The fact that he's taken on these titles and the ways in which we've come to think about these photographs speak to the coexistence of specificity and universality that come to define this American social documentary project, which really flourished from the late 1930s through the 1950s and came to an end largely with the advent of television, as it was the illustrated magazines like Life and Collier's and Pageant and Look and Health and Beauty and Women's Day. These were the magazines in which these photographs circulated and became the way through which society was viewed, seen, commented on, and known within the United States through the 40s and the 50s, in a way that we now think about the internet circulating, and our familiarity with digital images really has its precedence in this kind of print media of the time. Of course, the great project that's behind the generation of what produced much of this imagery, and what you probably heard of, is the Farm Security Administration, which was a government agency that had three lives. First, the Resettlement Administration from 1935 to 37, the Farm Security Administration from 37 to 42, and the Office of War Information from 1942 to 1944. I say that just because it gives you a little bit of a sense that the thrust of what the photographers were supposed to document changed from showing the human toll of the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl and the American worker in hardship and poverty to the documentation of support for the American war effort on the home front. But the photographers, many of them remained the same, although other photographers joined what was called the photography unit or the historical section of these agencies, and they were all under the aegis of Roy Stryker. He's the key figure here. Here's the economist. He is an economist from Columbia University who's hired by the US government to organize this photography project. And people who think about images in the 20th century in the United States, what I'm saying is known material. But what is less known is that in 1943, Standard Oil, after the war, was chastised for having cooperated with the Germans and profited with German oil companies and having profited from the war situation to make a lot of money. People were upset about this. People have been upset with Standard Oil since Standard Oil was founded, essentially, in the late 19th century, 1870, by John D. Rockefeller. Standard Oil had been plagued by controversy time and again for challenging antitrust laws, for buying up the little guy, for never colluding with big railroad, and really making it impossible to get your hands on anything to do with petroleum without somehow contributing to the benefits of Standard Oil New Jersey. And this was something that after the war, the company wanted to change its image. It needed to develop a whole new campaign to paint itself in a better light. And what did they do but hire Roy Stryker in 1943 to come on board, and on the heels of his successes from producing the most extensive documentation of American life in the 20th century with the kinds of photographs that we see here. And I just want to talk together through some of the qualities of what was so engaging about this material, about these images. You can see from these two images, for example, the women have these penetrating gazes. You immediately are drawn to look at them, to connect with them, in part because of their eyes and the deepness and the authenticity, as it were, of what they're communicating through their countenances. They also have signs of poverty, visual details that suggest they have hard scrabble lives, thin clothing, drawn faces, thin shoulders, missing buttons, clothes that maybe have been washed 1,000 times but still look kind of dirty. In the case of the mother on the right-hand side, she has her children clutched closely to her, but they're turned away. We can't see their faces. We can see their disheveled hair. There's something in there of the woman, perhaps the charwoman, we don't know her family situation, but they have people they're supporting. They have places where they pray. They have people to whom they're responsible. We can imagine that there are whole lives behind these women that we see. And despite their specifics, there's some sort of universal quality there, something standing for an American work ethic, for example, with that flag hanging in the background. She's got her mop, she's got her broom, she's going to do what she needs to make ends meet, despite the fact she's born in a situation likely where she was not given any kind of obvious advantage. These are the kinds of emotions that these photographs stir up just in a single image. And then when published with a caption or a small little bit of information that these photographers were trained to gather from the people that they photographed, those words would then direct your emotions, to want not only to see this record of society, but then compel the viewer to want to do something to improve it. And that is the key that distinguishes these photographs from other bodies of work, is that they function as a call to action. At least that's the desire on the part of the photographer. And actually, this is something I've been thinking about thanks to Daniel, in part, in his very rousing, even 5 minutes that we heard about. Well, what is it that artists are trying to do today? And who is it that's out there that's trying to use their work for some kind of larger purpose? Is that necessary? Not necessarily, but is it noble? I would say yes. And so I find these particular pictures attractive for this precise reason. And this is the kind of photographer that Esther Bubley was inspired by, Lang being a generation, really half a generation older than she, and so she cut her teeth as a photographer looking at Lang's pictures and other Walker Evans and other colleagues' pictures in the printed magazines. But she so aspired to join that kind of photographic work that she did everything that she could to make it possible. But what I find so compelling, and where my research is leading me, is to figure out what was it that these photographers were doing working for a company like Standard Oil. What does this tell us about the state of big business in the United States after, this is right on the heels of the Second World War. So we have to think about all of this against the backdrop of tragedy, of loss, of great conflict, of confusion, and of a real, I think, we might think of it almost naively today, but I don't think that we can underestimate the desire for healing that existed in the late 1940s across the board. And so there was that willingness to think about universal qualities that bound people, as opposed to focusing on the things that divide us. That might sound corny or somehow simplistic, but I think at the time, of course I can't say I wasn't there, but based on what I have lived with conflict and my own, perhaps it's an optimist in me that likes to think that we can focus on ways in which people connect. There's a project there. I wonder, is it unique to its time, or is there something more broadly human about the kind, in fact, humanist photography is often the term described, concerned photography, humanist photography. These are other labels that have subsequently been applied to this body of work, or to the photographers who emulated it. The other question I have about this work that I'm grappling with is the degree to which it does represent an American ideology. What is it in the photographs that we see that represent an American quality? Could this body of work have been produced elsewhere? Even if we'll never be able to answer that question, what is it in these images that, if we do believe they just somehow reflect an American ideology, an American ethos, how do we see that in these images? What does a national aesthetic at a moment look like? And to that extent, what happens when people with this mandate, and that mandate from Standard Oil was to show the benefits of oil in the lives of everyday Americans? What happens when a photographer like Esther Bubley becomes the one woman on board at Standard Oil and is sent abroad? She's sent to Italy, she's sent to Denmark, she travels through Germany, she goes to Morocco, she travels through a whole host of European and Mediterranean countries, taking pictures for Standard Oil to show the benefit of lives in Americans. And so I'm wondering, what does this say about foreignness and otherness? What does it say for an American Jewish woman to go to Italy and Germany on the heels of the Second World War and still document the humanity of oil in that context? And it's a very bizarre project. And so I'm fascinated by the photographs that were the result. So I want to talk first a little bit about who were the Standard Oil New Jersey photographers and what are some of the visual clues that we begin to see that bind their bodies of work together. I'm starting here with a bit of a backstory. I want to talk a little bit about where did Esther Bubley come from as a photographer. And I'm showing you here two pictures that she took early on. She came as a young photographer brimming with ambition. Let's say a young aspiring photographer. She wasn't hired yet, but she wanted to be. She wanted badly to work with Roy Stryker, who had a reputation for mentoring young photographers and giving them a break into the industry. So she arrives in Washington, D.C. at the age of 22 in 1941. She has just gone to art school and had a short stint at Vogue and wanted to earn her living as taking pictures. She had to start, however, as a lab technician in the National Archives, from where she moves over to work in a dark room at the Office of War Information, which you'll remember by then, this is 1942, is where Roy Stryker is working, where his photography unit is housed. But she's keen to move out of the technical aspects and to show her bravura as a photographer herself. So in her free time, she takes pictures first of a project documenting women at a local boarding house in Washington, D.C., two of whom were her sisters, who had come to Washington, women like her, who had come during the war looking for work, looking to free themselves up a little bit as women. If the three sisters could go, perhaps the parents would be happier. They're staying together at this boarding house. And she started to take pictures of the women there, like this somewhat melancholy portrait on the left of a woman who, as according to the caption and the title, is listening to a murder mystery on the radio. And I love the juxtaposition between details like these kind of happy teacups and happy teapots this is what I call them, the happy teapot motif on the little sort of tablecloth there on the shelf, and the murder mystery that she's apparently listening to on the radio. I think that and the lost in thought, lost in reverie expression, the deep shadow, taken with a flash here, most likely to get that kind of contrast of light indoors, has that noir feeling of intrigue and of the kind of excitement that a young woman could expect to find, hope to find, when having a little bit more liberty and freedom to move around than under the guise of her parents at home. Or the photograph on the right, she also was trying to take photographs of, she finally gets hired by Stryker at the Office of War Information, in part because of what he liked about this boarding house series and other series that she took. And then she was under this mandate, as were all of Stryker's photographers for the Office of War Information to show the dedication of Americans to the war effort on the home front. But what I find compelling about the way that she does this, you see the men in uniform in the background. They have their caps on, possibly they're in the Navy. They're there on the passenger bus, riding a streetcar rather in Washington, D.C. In March of 1943. But they are not her principal subject. The principal subject are the two women in the foreground on the streetcar, riding public transportation, having a friendly chat. And again, if you look at the details, they've got on their proper white gloves, and in her lap here, she's holding a paper bag, a brown paper bag. And we can imagine that perhaps she's holding lunch in there. Perhaps they're also on their way to work. Perhaps these are housewives whose husbands are off at war or who are otherwise serving, trying to get the American war effort moving forward. And they've had the opportunity or the responsibility or will require, for whatever reason, to go to work. Maybe they like that freedom, maybe they don't. But the point is that she has chosen to photograph in the foreground this new burgeoning role of American women in the guise of supporting that war effort at home. So we see here an early example of her doing her due diligence as to what she's supposed to do in her job. Satisfying, ticking off the boxes, she's doing what she's supposed to do, but she's definitely doing it in her own way. And one of the things I'm beginning to think is most American about this imagery is, or not necessarily most American, but most certainly demonstrates the greatest degree of art integrity, and where I think an artist with a capital A resides is in the dedication and unflagging commitment to one's own vision, despite the mandate that may be given by the person who's commissioned the work. It's subversive, it's not so obvious in all the imagery, but it's persistent, and I'm drawn to it. She also won awards eventually for a 1947 documentation she did of a bus trip, really across the country, up, down, right, left, east, west, north, south, documenting bus travel during the war. So you have to imagine this is a moment when materials like rubber and petroleum and steel and all raw materials that could be used to supply weapons or tanks or things that military exports would need were in short supply, and so Americans, rather than use their own cars, were supposed to perhaps take buses or economize, group together, rally for the greater cause. But rather than show the bus itself, or the tires, or the various specifics of that story, she chooses instead to focus on these two girls or other passengers on the bus. And there's this great sense of dynamism and the exuberance you can imagine in these two children who are getting on the bus for the first time. They're looking out the window, they're seeing new places. And perhaps there's something in their youth that represents a future generation of women that might experience even greater dynamism and greater movement and mobility and freedom than she herself, as the photographer, is experiencing at the time. Bubley shared this ethos with her other colleagues at Standard Oil New Jersey, as I said, many of whom had worked for Roy Stryker previously, including her colleague Gordon Parks. A series of images now of his I'm going to share with you. This is perhaps one of my top 5 favorite portraits ever. The way that he captures this man's determination, pride, sense of work, sense of commitment to what he needs to do. Perhaps there's an air of fatigue, of sadness, of frustration. There's so much rolled up in there. It's there in his eyes, it's there in the furrows above his brow, in the way his mouth is pursed, in the way he holds his hands together. And this was a portrait that of what's called a coal sketcher, coal workman or coal sketcher. So this is a man who's responsible for carrying the coal back and forth in Harlem. And I wanted to focus on this particular picture for a minute, in part because it starts to speak to one of the things I've begun to think about in terms of foreignness and Americanness. So Parks is from Kansas, he's a Midwesterner, and he really makes a name for himself as a photographer in Minneapolis and St. Paul, goes to the big city, the big Midwestern city, and starts to document well-to-do African-American life, and also for magazine portraits that are catering to Black society in Minneapolis and St. Paul. But he finally wins an award and gets to work for Stryker at the Farm Security Administration and then the Office of War Information. And he is then sent mostly to northern states, to New York City, to places that are where racial segregation is not the reality, although certainly the racial tensions are the reality. But he's a photographer who's strategically sent to places where he could work. He's an African-American photographer, I should mention this for those of you who don't know his work. And he finds himself in situations that New York City is as foreign to him as Rome to a degree. But my point is that there are cultures that he is, this main urban culture in the United States may be considered foreign to him in the same way that rural Vermont is foreign to one of the other photographers I'll discuss in a minute, Charlotte Brooks, who's from Brooklyn. These are photographers who were sent to communities that they were not necessarily a part of, but to document people with whom they may or may not have had an affinity for a whole host of reasons. And in terms of the kinds of imagery that they took there, I wanted to think also about what the documents at Standard Oil tell us about what was the mandate that these photographers were receiving, or what was the view about how photography served industry at the time. And I want to read here a brief quote by Roy Stryker, writing in 1947 about the kinds of pictures that he was trying to generate at Standard Oil through photographers like Parks and his colleagues. He says, quote, "It is obviously economically unsound to build up a file of pictures that flash like meteors across the news page of the country and then go into perpetual limbo. The pictures we like, meaning Standard Oil, are the ones that are used time and again." And this particular photograph, just to give an example, there was a recent retrospective of Gordon Parks' early work called The New Tide that was organized by the National Gallery of Art with the Gordon Parks Foundation, and then traveled to a series of museums, including the Cleveland Museum of Art, where this photograph, you know how it is when you circulate an exhibition, the curators select a handful, a dozen of press photographs that you get rights to reproduce those photographs expressly to publicize the event. You don't get the rights to use all of the photographs. And time and again, in fact, Parks' portrait of that coal sketcher is reproduced. Here we are, however many, 60 years on, he remains the face of Gordon Parks' early work, and yet this connection to Standard Oil at the time, the reason why this photograph was taken is not usually, or not always, accompanying the photo. Certainly when you go to see the exhibition, it's in the context of Standard Oil. But when it's reproduced on the internet for everybody to see without deeper knowledge of the material, the Standard Oil background is not present. I just note it. It's a photograph that certainly has resonance. However, its original context has fallen to the wayside. Parks was also sent to document farmers, perhaps potato farmers in northern Maine, Augusta, Maine. Here you're looking at one of his portraits where you can see a trope of one of the ways in which Parks, I think, is one of the greatest portrait photographers, certainly of the 20th century, arguably of all time. I mean, they just time and again, picture after picture, you almost feel like you're looking at the soul of a person. You certainly see their joy for work, their regard for doing what they have to do. And one of the ways in which this is achieved is this somewhat lower angle that you're using here, that you see Parks using. A little bit lower, it has this way of aggrandizing, making somehow monumental the figure before him, including this farmer in Augusta, Maine. He also, Parks had this wonderful eye for vernacular uses of photography. This recurs throughout his work, taken for Standard Oil or taken for Ebony or taken for any of the number of other, he was the first African-American photographer on staff at Life magazine. But he had this eye for example, a young couple wanting to get their photograph taken at the county fair in Maine, or he'll take, for example, photographs of tombstones with photographs of people tacked onto the corner. He certainly was a person, he did absolutely anything for the Parks to keep his ability to take photographs running. He wasn't always able to make money from taking pictures, so he would work in a restaurant, he would drive cars at night, he would do, you name it, he did it in order to continue to make photographs. Such commitment to this work. Another group of photographers at Standard Oil, somewhat reluctantly initially, but nonetheless they eventually sign on, are Louise and Edwin Roscombe. You'll see here in 1941, the two of them, only Edwin is credited, but the two of them collaborate with the great author Richard Wright on 12 Million Black Voices, which is a pictorial story through images and text, but it's one of these photographic illustrated books that the Roscombes worked on several to produce during this period, but it was typical of these photographers of the group that I'm describing. Let Us Now Praise Famous Men is perhaps the most celebrated of these collaborations between James Agee and Walker Evans, where a photographer and a writer would collaborate to produce these books, but they're books in which text and image play equal parts. They're not texts illustrated with images, and they're not images attached with captions. They really, each type of imagery or each type of communication, I should say, has its own role to play. They're like dances between images and text that are really very compelling. And the Roscombes, they had been, soon after they were married in 36, they also come to Washington, where Edwin Roscombe had been charged with organizing the FSA picture file. And it is in that while Louise works as a freelance photographer taking portraits of Washingtonian elites. Now she's from Philadelphia and living in Washington, D.C. in the 1940s, she is shocked by what she sees is the reality of racial segregation in the nation's capital at this time. She finds this appalling, as does Edwin, and they work very hard in their illustrated book work, which I just showed an example of, and also in their work with Standard Oil, to continue to show the injustice of racial segregation, despite the fact, again, that they're working for corporate America. One of the picture stories that they produce, and by picture story, I mean a suite of photographs, details focused on an individual, where through the story of an individual, the photographer tells a story about some aspect of American life, or through a series of details of American life. So this is oftentimes a mixture of close-ups, details, crops, zoomed out pictures that are intended to be published in series. They are like photographic equivalents of words that get then assembled into a sentence to say something larger. They're not necessarily intended to exist as single images, although they often do when they are as strong as I would argue this portrait is of Julius Rowe, which was the subject of one of their most important picture stories, of a series of pictures they took of an oil refinery in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Julius Rowe, in addition to being a porter at the Esso factory, in the chemistry lab of an Esso factory, so the gasoline chemistry lab, he would ride his bicycle up and down with little vials of chemical experiments This was his job during the day. On the weekends and in his community, he was the local preacher. And so the Roscoms spent lots of time with Julius on site, at the job, and at home. And I'm showing on the left another kind of visual trope from not just Farm Security Administration genre photographs, but also Lewis Hine and this sense of uplift, of reading, the way you see Julius Rowe at home reading with the books open in front. You see W.E.B. Du Bois representing African American families or people in this way. You see Lewis Hine also representing for the survey graphic. This is a typical long civil rights kind of image of social uplift. And here you see Gordon Parks, the Roscoms, reutilizing this type of imagery with Julius here on the left. And on the right, you see him at work in his congregation on a Sunday. And there are additional images of the other half of the room where all the women are seated. So the congregation naturally, or by custom, split into men seated on one side and women seated on the other. The other series of photographs they took at the refinery of the men lined up to get their paychecks. They had to line up in separate lines. You had black workers in one line, you had white workers in the other line, and they represented this very plainly in very straightforward, just the facts kind of style. They just put right out there, front and center, how is this possible? Look at what you're looking at, having now traveling in the South. So these are the ways in which these Standard Oil photographers, again, nominally celebrating here the achievements of this chemical research about gasoline refinery, petroleum refining in Baton Rouge. And yet the real core of what they want to show is a much larger comment on the state of American society at the time. One final photographer I want to talk about in this Standard Oil group is Charlotte Brooks, who was from Brooklyn, New York, and was sent off to document rural towns in New England, mostly, and also in upstate New York, where she was responding in part. There are these what are called shooting scripts in the Standard Oil archive, where Stryker lays out some of the subjects. He's really very light in the directions that he gave these photographers, but there was nonetheless a culture. There was a directive that they were, in their own way, responsible for fulfilling. And he writes, I want to accumulate a series of towns and cities all over the country. I want them to be well-known as well as little-known places. And he also talks about the importance of documenting the American highway, everything to do with the highway, the road, the car, the truck, the bus, the mailbox, the fence, the gas station, the intersection, the eatery, you name it, you encountered on the highway. He wanted it documented, however close or far or it was from the actual highway itself. And what you see Brooks here responding to is the center of American life and American communication in these small towns, which is the post office. And she's following here a father and son, Gilpin and Solon Staples, who work for the post office. And here she uses this great bird's eye view. So you see these photographers are clearly aware of histories of avant-garde picture making with extreme to the degree that you can get extreme within a post office. Angles from above and below. There's a degree of abstraction of the or repetition of forms with those letters in the letter boxes, the curve of the wire there in the foreground. So these are photographers who are highly skilled aesthetically and technically, but they also have the wherewithal to get to know the people where they are, even when they're in places where they have never been before and where they may share very little. And again, thinking about the foreignness and the ways in which people are relating between photographer and subject in these pictures, they have a way of getting down, we see that low angle again to give monumentality to the subjects. And there you see Gilpin, the postman, gathering letters from the people. So rather than the people like this woman who, clearly is just at home, there are the curlers, she's just, in her domestic environment, he's going out to the people who he probably knows each and every one of them and their individual stories to gather the mail and bring it into town. Of course, the way he's getting around town is in a car, on a road, and all of that is fueled with petroleum. So this work is in some way very insipid in the sense that at its core, you're looking at a casual American everyday encounter, and yet there is that response to the mandate of showing petroleum at work in the lives of everyday American citizens. I find it smart how photographers manage to stick to their guns and yet do what they needed to do. Charlotte Brooks, just a note on who she was. She went on to be the only woman on staff at Look magazine, where she worked for some 20 years and completed some 450 photo stories for them. Just a prolific photographer. And by the 1960s, just to give you a sense of where this work is going, the kinds of pushes in photography and in society that this moment in the 40s and 50s is going to take us to, as we know, she completed in the 1960s, a whole series of stories around the topic of the American woman, and in particular on what the obstacles that women face in the workplace due to race or due to marital status in these particular cases. And here you're seeing a still from a story that she did called The Long, Lonely Wait of the Young Divorce. So a woman who at the age of 27 had divorced and is now caring for her young son, and yet was trying to seek her life follow her life as a professional, or A New Job for Joan, a story on Joan Murray, who had been hired as a newscaster on television and was facing obstacles because of her gender, because of her race, and how a woman like Joan was making strides and charting new ground in the world of something as high profile as television newscasting. These were typical for the kinds of stories that Charlotte Brooks took on, and she was recently the subject of a retrospective at the Davis Museum at Wellesley College in 2016. So finally, 60 years later, these photographers are starting to really be celebrated. But they took some of the most striking pictures that had deep social and political commentary, but because they were being published perhaps in a ladies' magazine, didn't necessarily at the time hit you over the head, which was maybe at the time the way that they could hit you over the head. That was the sort of avenue that was available. So earlier in here when I was doing a run through, and I was sitting here with Stefano, and we were talking about this picture, and I was talking about the resonance between, you look at the background of the divorced woman, what you see, how does this picture work to make a commentary on divorce if you don't necessarily see it in the context of the magazine? So in the background, you see the young family, the child on the shoulders, you see perhaps let's say, the standard of what a happy young family should be. And then in the foreground, you see the woman bent over, tying her son's shoes. So there's been this progression towards focusing on our subject and what she has left behind, what she's struggling to, how she's struggling to make ends meet now in her new situation. You see a similar visual trope happening in this photograph. In the far background, you see a man, perhaps a barista, overlooking the entire scene. In the middle ground, you see a woman holding a child in a baby in this blanket. But then in the foreground, you see a young woman, Giuliana Campioni, and now we're in Rome, having a sip of a coffee, cappuccino, espresso. She has on her earring, she has on recently painted nails, and the other half of the image is taken over with this massive espresso machine, which is probably greased with some form of petroleum. And here we are looking at Esther Bubley's wonderful, I think, photographic story where she followed Giuliana Campioni, who was a young hostess on the CRT bus, the TRT, some new bus line that was opening up, taking passengers from Rome to various points throughout Italy. Bubley followed Giuliana on a series of trips, just as she had taken the bus trips across the United States. All of a sudden, she's traveling now in 1952 in Italy. Here they are in Rome. This picture, I think it's fabulous, the way she's using this backlighting, the silhouette of the man up there tying probably the bags onto the top of the bus. But when you see up there, you see the bicycle. This is 4 years after 1948, I Ladri della Bicicletta, the bicycle thieves, Vittorio De Sica's great neorealist film in which the bicycle signals so much about Italians wanting to move forward and forthcoming modernization and mobility. And you see that bicycle up there on top of the bus. When photographers like Bubley and her colleagues were sent abroad or were sent anywhere, they were given crib sheets of facts that they could study to know something about the place where they were going. And these were photographers who were typically doted with an insatiable curiosity, so they probably did as much research as they could about the places where they were about to photograph. And then they had the kind of character and charisma where on the ground, in conversation with the people they encountered, even if somewhat piecemeal because of the language barrier, they got to know enough of the situation so that they could try to record its details to the degree possible with the greatest amount of authenticity to the situation, but always, as I say, maintaining this commission from Standard Oil in mind and their own artistic vision. So here you see other steps along this. Here you see a bus trip, the passengers loading the bus at Piazza Esedra or Piazza della Repubblica in Rome. You may have been there recently when you got off of Stazione Termini. It's not far from there. Or the local Esso station in an unnamed village, which is clearly in the throes of modernization, with a building like this one in the background where you can see through its windows that it's under construction. All the while struck by this Mediterranean light, these long shadows that you get in probably the early morning, and that spray of fountain. There are things that are attractive to an artist's eye. And then with the Stefanos doing the run through, immediately they recognize this road, which I don't recognize, but they do, as the Via Appia Nuova that connects Rome to Naples. Stefano even pinpointed it as just below Terracina, connecting on its way to Fondi. And I said, and what do you think about that? I didn't even finish the sentence, Stefano Genna. But that's what they did for the lighting at night, because there was no public lighting, and the car lights would light up these white strips of paint on the tree trunk so they wouldn't go careening into the trees newly planted to line that newly paved road leading straight through town. And yet, with that sign of contrast, there's that cart we see again with the donkey pulling it, showing that contrast between traditional ways of life and progress on the horizon. All the while in this body of imagery, I would argue that progress wins out in the sense that there seems to be, to my eye, a value placed on progress. It is appreciated. It is what is supposed to be celebrated at this time. And I think that ethos changes as we move through the years and the decades. But I would argue that this is a moment, especially when commissioned by Standard Oil, that modernization is something to be valued and is something that is celebrated. So this is essentially the 1950s Italian street light, for lack of more electricity. But clearly it's on its way because the telephone poles have been electrical wiring, it's all been laid. It might just not be in place yet. So it's very much in progress. She also seems to be attracted to those scenes that you would not get in an American town. Those preti at the seminary, the priests studying to become priests at seminary in Assisi on the same bus trip, where she's using that same elevated view that we see Charlotte Brooks use at the post office, but she's capturing something that in this case is really distinctly Italian, or anyway distinctive to, let's say, a Catholic country. Or you see also Henri Cartier-Bresson and other photographers respond to these same priests at Scamno, or the black-robed figures, be they priests, be they widows, and the striking contrast against the lighter stone in Italian towns. This tends to be something that foreign photographers in particular, but also local, like Mario Giacomelli. There are beautiful series. You could do a whole exhibition of just black figures in silhouette against white grounds in Italian context. It's attracted a lot of people, and Esther Bubbley was among them. But her reportage of Giuliana Campioni continued in the same way that Julius Rowe, the Roscoms, followed him at home, or Gordon Parks and some of his other pictures followed his individuals that were the protagonists of his picture stories at home. You see that Juliana would have to, in addition to drive the bus, read to the children or iron the clothes. These are not her children, these are her siblings, but she had to carry out these other duties once she got home. Also on this trip, Esther Bubley went to Denmark. It wasn't this particular trip, but during, let's say, this arc of 3 to 5 years, she went to Denmark to take a whole series of pictures. If the bus takes you around the United States and Rome, it's the ferry that takes you around Denmark's more than 500 islands and connects you to places in Sweden and other Scandinavian countries. So the ferry is sort of like, in this instance, the Danish bus, of course, fueled by the same petroleum that the bus requires. And you would see similar tropes of the ferry docking and being unloaded then by the Danish equivalent of a workhorse, but the same contrast of the horse and cart picking up the goods from the ferry. But I stumbled across this picture she took as part of the Danish series of the passengers on the bus, where apparently among Danish women smoking a cigar is one of the Danish customs. And Bubbly included this lengthy caption where she talks about the 23,000 trips a year, the 32 trips daily in winter, the 175 automobiles that are taken by these ferries, the 334,000 bicycles, the 90,000 railway cars that make this 380 kilometer trip annually. I mean, she's almost scientific in the detail that she recounts about these ferries. And yet the pictures she shows focus on one of the passengers that has this kind of gaze, that has this kind of, taking a ferry ride can be, what's the word, sleep-inducing, and maybe she's, there in a kind of moment of relaxation and reverie, but I nonetheless, maybe it's the context of this talk, but I see this determination and this kind of smile in her eyes, this sense of contentment that she's here on her own, at least on her own in this picture, and there is this reflection of yet another woman in a similar situation in the window. By way of conclusion, I just wanted to think together visually for a moment about the future of this imagery, or what I might call the legacy, the inheritors of this body of work. I thought about Joel Sternfeld's American Prospects, where he includes this photograph, for example, of the mail delivery man in a Kickapoo tribe in Eagle Pass, Texas, where a focus on the postal system is no longer about petroleum, no longer about oil, but rather a commentary on the degree to which indigenous groups in the United States have been outcast from society, are physically farther away, clearly from the state of the housing in which they're living, are struggling to keep themselves together, where photographs that are about similar subjects take on a very different intent. Or a still here from Lorna Simpson's 2003 two-channel video Corridor, where I don't know if people here are familiar with it, but it's 2 channels for about 13, 15 minutes, where it's the same actress, but in about 100 years difference, going through where if this woman exits, then she enters in the other frame. It's a very organic movement between 2 women the differences in life in terms of the century that's passed, the century of, in theory, racial progress, and where the woman in the left, who's in a more modern situation, has arrived, but the differences are through kerosene and through technology that recur throughout this video. Petroleum also plays a large role in this work, but clearly that's not what's at. Technology is certainly of interest to Lorna Simpson in this video, but it is not the thrust in the same way that it is with the Standard Oil pictures. Rather, it's a much larger commentary about race and society at the turn of the 21st century. Or someone like the Canadian photographer Edward Burczynski, who, with his large series, Oil, that spans several years at the early part of the 21st century, brings front and center in these very large, highly detailed prints the great impact that oil and the extraction of other natural resources from the landscape has, let's say, the environmental toll of something like the Standard Oil project. And that, I think, is where we see any kind of commentary among photographers today thinking about oil. No longer are we interested in the humanity of the oil industry, but rather what Reinhold Martin, and this is where the title of my talk comes from, the cost of the carbon empire. And by that he means the oil system, not just the refineries and the transport, but the war, the lives lost, the miners, the oil riggers, everything that seems to be wrong with the world today, you name it, the flooding in Germany, the fires in California, it's all been pushed too far. And a photographer like Susan Meiselas, a resident here at the Academy about 4 or 5 years ago, has been doing this ongoing project called Coal and Ice, where she and her colleague Jeroen de Grijs an exhibition designer in the Netherlands, are calling attention to what the kinds of projects like Standard Oil, the cost of what they put us through on some level, the beauty that can be found in the images, but now to trigger our emotions to improve climate change, or to address it, to do something about that. So there's a similar call to action, but the action now is one that's very different. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions if there are any. Marla and then essay.
Yeah, so I have a thought and then a question. The first image of the Black woman with the mop and the broom and the flag, that struck me as ironic, right? That, I don't know, I was thinking about the role of the flag behind her poverty, and like on the one hand, I think it's trying to say she's doing her part in the war effort, and then in a way the broom and the mop are sort of weapons in that, but then I don't know. Is there an element of irony that the American?
Certainly.
Yeah.
There's definitely an element of irony. I guess for me now, it's hard to see this image as just a single image because I know it now well within the context of the picture story from which it comes, where there's this Ella. She didn't have children of her own. She takes care of her niece's young children, so she's supporting something like 3 children under 5 on this minuscule little salary. And he shows her at home, and he shows her a little area of her room where she prays. And it's such a poignant and dignified portrait of Ella that I can't help but see the dignity. And certainly there's irony there that, of course, here's this woman who's working so hard for being, and cleaning, where is she doing her cleaning? But for the US government, which is not rising to the occasion to support her. But absolutely, there's a finger in the eye there. But with regard to her, that picture story from which this picture comes, is really very a deep respect for her as a subject.
And then my specific question was, when they would go out to take photographs for Standard Oil, was there a set of directions?
Like, yeah, well, this is what I was suggesting. There are these what they call shooting scripts, and there are other articles published by Stryker and his colleagues about what they envisioned was the role of photography, not as advertising, not as propaganda, but, and I love this turn of phrase, as an exciting product is coming from their cameras, a potent raw material from which to compound new histories. So they're really writing about a portrait of American life. They saw it as so much bigger than advertising and propaganda was the flash in the pan. That was the meteor that you never saw again. They were trying to construct something larger. So the way, when it came down to instructions, that's why I said they were light. There was a culture, and I'm going to use that word in the way Robin used it in our first conversations. It was a mode of approaching the camera that you knew there's, because these certain visual tropes, they recur, that juxtaposition between modernity and tradition, the focus on the individual, the focus on standard of life, who has it, who doesn't, what are they doing to improve it, these things, or little, as I say, the details of poverty, or the details of like the nail polish or the cigar, showing some kind of emancipation among women that's a newly found freedom. But does Stryker go so far as to say, find me a woman with nail polish? No. He leaves, and this is where I think he's a good manager. He hires good people and trusts them to do what they do because he knows they have strong artistic visions. And this is why I think they're good
But that's
artists.
not the Standard Oil part.
That is the Standard Oil.
Oh,
That
he
is
was
the
Standard
part.
Oil.
That they're so effective at it that we don't even notice.
Thanks.
Yeah. So essay and then Elizabeth.
Well, thank you so much for hearing me.
Yes, again.
Cool. Thank you so much for this talk. It's really impressive how you're able to sort of track us through all of the things that you're like fleshing out in real time. It was really.
Did it make sense? One never knows from this.
I thought it was great. It's really difficult to do, and I think Elizabeth is right. You're a really good teacher. So I have a question. Maybe it's hopefully in conversation with Marla's, but I wonder. So not to be so academic, my direct question is: can you say a little bit more about your main artist, sort of political background. You touched on it a little briefly when you were talking about, I mean, it made me have a little whiplash when you mentioned that she was Jewish and going in 1941 to Europe. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that, specifically in the context of this Standard Oil project, because then when you responded to Marla, you're talking about, you know, the propaganda of the flash in the pan. My initial question before Marla's question was, you know, where we're talking about modernization, I'm seeing accumulation. Where we're saying, seeing insipid, I'm seeing insidious. I'm actually seeing it as precisely the point that we have this litany of accumulation and enumeration, which is, you know, a part of like an imperial or colonial project. I always give the numbers to say 17,422 bodies on this specific day. On the 4th of July, it was 22 degrees. You know what I mean?
Yes.
This litany of enumeration as actually the point of empire, so that yes, we see this dynamic, humanizing, soulful image, and so we see the raw material not of the petroleum, but of the people incorporated into this capitalist project. So what are the photographers who have this brilliant artistic vision? Are they pro this? So precisely because they get to extend their artistic vision, but it's still in the service of the same imperial formation that is incorporating all of them.
It's absolutely true. And I think I'll respond to the last part first, before the part last. Yes, you picked up exactly on the American empirical project, which is why I was so drawn to Reinhold Martin's phrase of the carbon empire. In the documents I was reading, at one point, one of the engineers for Standard Oil, George Fairmouth, I think is his name, he's writing to, I believe it's Stryker or another one of the leaders at Standard Oil, and he says, he talks about great moments in turning points in American history, the American Revolution, where propaganda, and that's the word he uses, is served to sort of sway the pendulum of history to go in what he viewed as the right direction. And he says, parentheses, there was of course, the greatest moment when this happens is in the Roman Empire, and St. Paul was this great propagandist. So they're absolutely seeing this as an imperial prospect. And in fact, in that same letter, he goes on to say how American business is an extension, in his view, at least the engineer's view, and not everybody signed on to this whole view, but nonetheless it was there. He said in his view that American business genius, that's how he put it, was to serve as essentially an extension of the American government project, that they were bedfellows and they should operate in tandem. So that if the US Marshall Plan is providing billions of dollars to Italy as a doorway between Western capitalism and Eastern communism, to use a kind of boiled down description, but nonetheless, you know what I mean, that Standard Oil was swooping right behind and follow up with the project. So they're very much in bed together in this American imperial project. You're absolutely right. But to the degree to which the photographer, this is why I'm struggling with this material. I so respect these photographers. And yes, you see, for example, the Roskins write specifically about how they were on the fence about joining Stryker at Standard Oil. They were not convinced it was a good idea. But I think we also have to appreciate how for photographers to get regular paychecks with the ability to have creative freedom was rare. And maybe it was just so enticing that it was just too good to pass up. And I can appreciate that. And as long as it seems to me, and this is what I find ultimately so exceptional about this work, as long as there was the ability to continue to use the camera in a crusade towards social justice, even if they were, cashing in on Standard Oil to support their ability to do that somehow that was okay. In terms of Esther Bubley's specific political leanings, I am not that far along to know. But many of these women, many of the photographers that were working with Jewish, newly immigrant, it was a diverse and, just socially, they shared a commitment to a larger social project, despite whatever else they may have brought to fiction. You're welcome. Thank you for the question. Elizabeth.
A more mundane question, but it connects to, I think, especially your answer to Essay's question and also your answer to Marla's question. And I guess I'm not clear what Standard Oil was going to do with the photographs and
yes,
where they were going to show them. And so, and that gets to your answer to Marla, which was, well, if you saw this in sequence, you might have a different
Yes.
And also to SA's question in your response, which is, what are the artists thinking is gonna happen to this work? Do they think it's gonna go in an archive? It's gonna go in a magazine? There's gonna be a show? They're gonna see the series of a particular individual?
Yeah, it's
Or
a great
can you say
question.
more
And
about that?
so what Stryker was doing, what the photographers knew they were contributing to, was to collect the creation of a picture file from which, first of all, Standard Oil had its own in-house publication called The Lamp. And so many of these picture stories, in fact, the Denmark project she does for The Lamp, knowing it would be published as a picture story in the Standard Oil publication. But that's just a small fraction. What would happen then is that other publications, newspapers, magazines, from whatever walk of life, could source, just like today, if you have something you have to illustrate, you go on the internet and you source a picture, you use it. That was the function, to create a picture file of American life from which any publication could source the image for free, use the photograph, and attach whatever caption they needed to, and put it in there. And photographers knew that this would happen. This is why Magnum was founded in 1947, so that photographers get more rights and more control over what happens to their pictures, so that people stop using it in ways that are not in line with their own beliefs. And what's even, I thought, more fascinating about the Standard Oil, it was used for exhibitions, and it was often used in textbooks. They became these textbooks about photography at war, oil at war, anyway, or how oil works, oil in your daily life. And these are for school children, talking about oil as a raw material. What is the standard of living? Yours is improving. Guess what? It's so didactic. It's almost shocking. And you wonder where our dependence on oil comes from. It's just go to Standard Oil is very obvious.
Essays where it's insidious,
Yeah.
is a pretty good one, yeah.
Exactly. We will take one last question from Grace, unless, also so that we can have a little break before dinner, maybe appreciated for everybody. Grace.
Yes, I think that, thank you, these images are gorgeous, it was a pleasure to look at them. And jumping off of both Essay and Elizabeth, I would be curious have you looked into, and clearly you've looked into the afterlives of these pictures in textbooks, et cetera. Have you started sort of correlating that to a shift in, American feeling about Standard Oil? I would be interested not only in the artist intent, but also their effect.
Definitely, and that's of course what Standard Oil wanted. So that's what speaks. Marla had this question similar in her talk, but well, how then you see in a fascist state, how can you get an honest view of what was the reception? Or in the Standard Oil material, I'm not going to get the honest view. So I have to think, where else could I find it? And that would be an interesting question to think about. Where could I find a trace of how public reception of the company moved forward? What magazines, what printed trace? It's a good question. I have to put my thinking cap on that. Unless there's any other burning question, we can also take it up to bar, talk about it over dinner. I really appreciate your listening, and I want to thank you all very much for coming. And please join us again next week when Jessica and Eugenio are going to continue the conversation that we all are going to continue to engage in the rest of the year. Thank you very much. Yeah.